Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is supposed to be a vlog, but it kind of didn't work out that way. I don't know what's happened. It's a bit of a mess. But basically, I was asked a quick question over on my writing Instagram by Charlene, who asked what my world building tips were. And it kind of took me back a little bit because I was like, well, I don't really know because I'm teaching myself world building and I'm still teaching myself it. It's not something that I'm like an expert in or anything like that, but it gave me enough of an idea to sit and record another writing journal, a writing vlog, as it were, where I can just sort of discuss the ideas that I have for now. I don't know what ideas I'm going to have maybe like 6 months from now, a year from now, who knows. But I'm still learning about world building. I'm very much on a journey in that sense. And so the points I'm going to make in this video are points that are completely my opinion and then just happen to be relevant to me. Please bear in mind, I'm very tired. I'm still a little bit hungover because it was Christmas yesterday, so I hope everybody had a really good Christmas. And for some reason, I just don't have the ability to speak English very well. And at the same time, the original vlog that I had originally filmed, I somehow managed to corrupt all the files so none of them can be edited. So I'm trying to remember a lot of what I said during those vlogs in this particular video. So it might seem like the video is a little bit kind of choppy and all over the place and I'm not speaking properly and I'm saying a lot and saying and a lot, but just bear that in mind. But with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video and please help me out if you know of any other resources or any books or anything like that that might be helpful. Please put them in the comment section down below because other than educating myself, you'll also be helping out other writers who happen to stumble across this video. So yeah, without further ado, cheesy intro and then the video. World building in its most simplest form is the construction of a narrative world in which your story, poem, game, and such and so forth are going to be set. The world building that you end up doing, however, is not something that's going to be limited to maybe just one novel. It doesn't always have to be that way. A lot of the times it is. But a lot of times, world building can be something that's a lot more expansive and can involve other stories from different lineages, different stories from different parts of the world that just build up an entire series that a lot of people will ultimately end up either enjoying or adapting in some way or another. So the basis of world building is just purely just to sort of test you as a creative, as a writer, to see how expansive and how far you can go with writing your novel. One of the main downsides though with world building that I've come across, and this is just me and just all me and what I've sort of like come across in my own research, is that when it comes to writing or reading a novel, a lot of writers tend to either put too much effort into their character development and not so much into their world building and world development, or you get the total opposite where you get a lot of writers who put a lot of work and effort into their world building and then not a lot goes into their character development. As a writer, you kind of need to read and research and then play with your own techniques to try and figure out how you can make a really good balance between what goes on in the world and how that impacts your characters and what your characters do that impact the world. You find that more with fantasy stories of various genres, so fantasy, urban fantasy, high fantasy, that kind of stuff. You find that a lot with those particular stories. Something as expansive, say, as like the Game of Thrones series or even the Harry Potter series, the Chronicles of Narnia series, and obviously the big king of them all, the Lord of the Rings series, they're all set in worlds where you can actually visualize what's going on because the writers have put in more than enough information about the background and about the world and what goes on with around the characters that you're able to imagine a lot more easily what the characters are doing, where they're going, what the certain locations will actually look like and how they're going to correspond with the story that you're actually reading or writing. I also find in a lot of world building books, I don't have anything here that will allow me to show you, but a lot of books, especially older books, in the front and the back of each book, you will find a really nice map that will go along with the story. So as you're reading along with a certain character, the hero of the story, for example, and he's gone from one location to the next, and there's goblins here, and then he's going to another location and there's something else going on there, you can actually then flip back to those particular maps and then go, oh, so he's traveled maybe this amount of kilometers or whatever. It kind of gets the reader feeling a bit more wet around the mouth, and they're feeling a bit more immersed into the story themselves, which is ultimately the sign of a really good story. Writing the stories that I'm working on right now, it's partially just writing, which most days, believe it or not, most days I'm able to just sit down, and once I'm in the zone, I just keep writing and stuff just keeps coming out, and then I'll leave that particular file, and then a few days later I'll come back and edit. But for the most part, I'm able to just write things, just kind of get things off my chest as quickly as possible, and it's actually kind of helpful. On the other hand, writing is also a lot of research, which it's fun to do research, and like I said, it's fun to do a lot of world building at the same time, but then actually putting all that research together and then putting all that world building in together and even character development and adding that to the pot, and then saying to myself, okay, I've got a plan, or I'm going to try and plot something around this kind of really sketchy plan and then just sit and write. And that's when it becomes quite difficult for me, because it's like, oh, there's limitations here that I've set for myself. There are certain rules that I've set for myself that I need to follow for the sake of continuity and character development and story development and all that kind of stuff. So world building is a lot of fun. It takes me away from the slightly more difficult elements of writing itself. But at the same time, I can get a little bit too deep into world building, and then I have to kind of pull myself out of it and go, okay, no, I need to just relax a little bit. Otherwise, it's just going to be way too structured, and then I'll end up writing a story that's going to be having way too much world building involved and not so much story and character plot and development. So it's a weird thing, but I do really, really love world building. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense to you. But how do I do world building? Okay. Reading and research. Now, whether it comes from reading novels and then sort of coming across one small sequence that happens and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. Those flowers are so magical. Let's appropriate that. So I'll do that. I won't necessarily add them to my own whips, but it's enough to kind of get my creative juices flowing. Another form of reading that I tend to do is mostly non-fiction reading. So essays, journal articles, critical theory papers and things like that. I get a lot of inspiration from those, and it's mostly because as an ex-English literature student, you have to figure out a way creatively to apply a critical theory to a work of literature that is fiction. So you have to be able, for example, to apply the Ratman theory by Freud to a short story about a man who has an imaginary friend, but you're not quite sure if it's an imaginary friend or not. Do you know what I mean? So you have to be able to apply a form of non-fiction, critical theory work to something that is going to be fictional. And that's where I get a lot of my inspiration from. If I come across a theory that seems really cool, I then get into my head a lot of ideas about characters and imagining a character trying to explain this journal to another character, or how could I then apply those non-fictional elements to something that is fictional, that of my own creation. So that's basically where I get a lot of my ideas from. 99% of the time, most of those ideas never make it to paper, or they never make it to the point where I feel like, yes, I could work on something like this and then turn it into something that could feasibly be printed in the future. It's merely for me just an exercise to keep my creative flows and juices going. Another way that I go about world building is looking at questions, prompts, writing prompts, that sort of thing. Writing prompts, depending on if there's a particular theme or depending on how many questions you find from a writing prompt, those can be really helpful as well. One of my favorite forms of writing prompts, daily writing prompts that I get is from two particular folks that I love to follow on Twitter who are absolutely amazing. They basically came up with this whole hashtag concept called hashtag Whip World Builders, and every single day there is a question that they put out on into the writing community, and then people can just come across those questions and answer them either underneath those particular images or daily prompts, or by retweet and commenting. I tend to retweet and comment because I want people to see the actual tweet that I'm referring to so people can get more involved in the game. It's a lot of fun. So I've put their handles down below. I've put the hashtag and everything, so you just look for them and just join in. If you happen to be part of the writing community on Twitter, join in. It's a lot of good fun. The one thing that I found incredibly helpful with their questions, however, is the fact that they ask a lot of questions which seem like, to the normal person, just seem like general questions. But if you're working on a story where you're building the world yourself, these are questions that really force you to explore your own creativity, explore your own world, and really develop the world in such a way that you can hopefully write and provide a very immersive experience for your future readers. They've asked questions that I haven't even thought twice about. Like, for example, the education system, or how religion and philosophy are treated within my world, and things like that. I have found them incredibly insightful and very, very helpful. So that's why I'm trying to get you guys to check them out as well. So go away and do that. It's good. It's good fun. When it comes to working on my own whips, however, the Wormwood Witches series, which is an urban fantasy, character development was actually the thing that got me started within the world of world building. Initially, I came up with the concept of the villain, I want to say a good maybe 3 and a bit years ago. I'm not quite sure. But I came up with the concept of the villain and what he was doing to one of the minor characters. The villain, however, was not human. I don't know why I'm feeling like I need to do this, but whatever. He's not human. And so when you first meet him in the prologue of the first story, he's in one of his demonic forms, basically. He's a demon in one of his demonic forms. But he seemed to be a very interesting character. So after I'd written that entire sequence out, I think I started writing it at like 3 a.m. because it came to me like in a dream. It was really bizarre. And I wrote it all out. And then later on, I started working on that particular prologue a little bit more, adding more to the scene, trying to flesh it out. I was just very intrigued by the villain and the minor character that he was haunting. So much so that led me into the Wormwood Witches series anyway. I ended up wanting to develop a story around the villain. I wanted to develop a story around the minor characters' family members and things like that. So that's how I ended up fleshing out a little bit of the characters, which then led me into fleshing out a plot, a potential plot. Like, the plot of my story has changed at least 3 times now, but I'm still running with the same original plot, like as kind of like the underlying arc. But anyway, and so from character development, it went into plot development, and then from plot development, it then went into world building, and world building has since taken over the entire project. World building, like I said, is probably the most exciting part of writing, because it means I'm able to not only develop the world in which the villain and the other characters happen to exist, but it means that I'm then forced to, sorry, there's like a little reminder that came up. It forces me then to think more about the rules and limitations that I can set for myself and for the novel. And in turn, that will then force me to keep up the continuity, because I want to be able to write an entire 3-book series for the Wormwood Witches. And I need there to be elements of continuity that runs through all 3 of those books. And then any of the standalone books that I happen to write, that happen to be set within the same time frame and within the same world, that have their own kind of storylines. I need there to be elements of continuity throughout. So world building, as expansive and as fun as it is, it's also something that will force you to really think about how you can balance out your story and how well you're going to be able to write your story in order to impress the readers of the future. Hopefully that makes sense. It probably doesn't, but I'm just going to continue on anyway. please make sure that you do get involved with the game #WhipWorldBuilders, and make sure that you either reply to or quote tweet either of the 2 accounts that I've listed below. I do love those games. I love it. It's fun. Writing prompts are really, really good fun. They just force you to really question the world that you've created. They force you to think about the creativity and the creative input that you have with your whips and with world building. They just force you to really get immersed in your own story, so that readers later on, when you actually get around to publishing, can get really immersed in your story and your creation as well. So world building is a very essential thing, but just, you know, play with it, practice, have fun with it, see how far you can go with it, see what limitations you can create for yourself and how you can creatively get around those limitations. Because you got to think about it. When writers write something that they've created, whether it's, you know, whether it's something that's fantastical or horrifying or whatever, a lot of readers don't know what your process is. They're not going to know what your process is. They're not going to be there when you're actually writing the story and then going through the whole publication process with you. They're only going to get the end result. So you need to make sure that the world that you've created within the story that you have created is one that follows a certain kind of linearity and a certain kind of has certain levels of continuity to it, so that the reader can be completely immersed in your story and not feel the need to pick out any weird aspects of the story or any loopholes or anything that doesn't make sense or anything like that. The first book I'm going to mention is the Wonder Book, a illustrated guide to creating imaginative fiction by Jeff Vandermeer. It's a bit of a chunky book. Obviously the cover's there, but that's basically, this is the expanded and revised edition. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's a fantastic book. It's very well thought out. Jeff Vandermeer goes into details about what world building is and what character development is, how important it is to the plots and things like that, and where you can go to get more imagination or imaginative ideas and how you work with inspiration and things. And then on top of that, he's also sat and interviewed or asked other authors to write down their own sort of methods and how they approach world building and plotting and things like that. So you get a lot of information, not just from Jeff Vandermeer, but also from other authors. That way it kind of helps you stay a bit more confident with your own world building, because then you suddenly realize, okay, well, whatever ideas I come up with, they're not completely wrong. They're not wrong at all. When it comes to writing, they're not wrong at all. Just experiment and work with something and then come up with your own version or your own guide that will help you with writing future works later on down the line. That's also how a lot of really well-known writers get a lot of their stories published very, very quickly, because once they've got a method that they know works for them, that's the kind of method that they tend to stick to. So think of like Margaret Atwood when she was writing the Oryx and Crake series. It took her half an hour after finishing the first manuscript for the first book to start writing on the second book, because she knew exactly what world she was writing everything in. She knew exactly what method she was going to be going by, and that's what she stuck to. She stuck to her guns, and she was able to get through those books very, very quickly. The same with Stephen King. He has tons and tons and tons of books out, but that's because as an imaginative person and as a creative writer and a creative person, he's able to come up with very nuanced stories very, very, very quickly, and then he's able to just sit down and write them out, because again, he's come up with his own methods that work for him and such and so forth. So these kind of books are really helpful for that, and that's what Jeff Vandermeer has basically just gone through throughout this entire book of his. Bear that in mind, bearing him in mind rather, Jeff Vandermeer and his wife Anne Vandermeer have written several books, regardless of what genre you happen to be writing in, whether it's steampunk or whatever. There are tons and tons of resource books and stuff and guides that they've actually written themselves, either together or individually. So I'd highly recommend checking out some of their titles if you are writing for particular genres and such and so forth. So that's Wonder Book for you. The second book that I would highly recommend is the Story Grid, which is actually what inspired the Story Grid podcast, written by Sean Coyne. I have found not only the podcast but also the book to be incredibly helpful as well. It's really good to sit and read about what good editors actually want from stories, because they know what sells and what doesn't. So Sean Coyne is an editor. He's been an editor for like 30 plus years from what I remember. So he knows what sells and what doesn't. And getting his advice direct from the editor is actually incredibly helpful. In the Story Grid book, you get to see various ways that a story grid can be sort of like set up and then written on, and how a story can develop from that. He goes into character development, world building. He also uses a lot of examples from other stories and movies. Like I said, different genres of media, whether it's movies, books, and such and so forth. He uses other examples to show you how to set up a really good story and a really good narrative and a very immersive world at the same time. So those are the two most important books that I found incredibly helpful when it comes to world building. The next two books I'm going to be mentioning have been written by Sacha Black. She's an amazing writer in and of herself. So I'll put some of her details down below so you can check out her and her works too. The first book that I'm going to mention, actually no, both books I'm going to mention deal with more character development, but like I've always kind of held true to, at least for myself, character development goes hand in hand with world building. You can't have good character development if there isn't a world for these characters to actually be developed in, and you can't have a good world if there aren't any characters for readers to actually then follow and explore the world with. So I always kind of put those two together. So the first book that I'm gonna discuss is 10 Steps to Hero, How to Craft a Kick-Ass Protagonist. This book is really neat and quite a small book, so it actually goes into a lot of details about how to develop your protagonist in a much more robust and more defined way. But it's a very accessible book. It's a really, really fun book, and there are a lot of exercises inside that will give you enough ideas and inspiration to go away and develop your own protagonists for your own stories. Now, in that same vein, there is also another book that she has come out with called 13 Steps to Evil. And this one is about crafting the most badass villains that you can ever think of. Like I mentioned with my own whips, it was the villain that came to me first, and that's where I ended up developing the storyline, and then I ended up going away and developing a little bit more about the world and other characters and how they're going to try and combat him. The very last book that I'm going to mention is The Rhetorics of Fantasy by Farah Mendlesohn. This particular book is more of a critical theory approach to the world of fantasy, the fantasy genre, and like the many ways that fantasy can be told within the world of storytelling. What Mendelssohn has actually done is that she's come up with 4 main areas or 4 main methods of how fantasy stories are told, and I found it to be quite not only immersive and fantastical, but it was actually very inspirational and very helpful when thinking about what my fantasy stories are and how I'm going to be telling them. And then from a theoretical point of view, imagining how a reader would theoretically look at my particular stories, which again is kind of what helps me write my stories the way that I do. English fails me today. It completely fails me. Anyway, that's basically the 5 books that I really, really like. Those are the 5 books that I tend to turn to a lot for just a bit more guidance. They're books that I tend to reread over and over because I remember certain passages, and if something sort of like sparks an idea from one of those stories when I'm writing my own story, I'm able to then just grab those books off the shelf, reread that section again, and then it will kind of help me tie up any loose ends that I've had difficulty in trying to put together when working on my own whips. So those are just a few books, but like I said, just bear that in mind. These are only like a few books that I've had so far. I'm still researching the world of world building. I don't have a great deal of writing books that deal with world building, just general writing books rather. So if there's a ton of books that you're probably sitting there going, oh, well, you haven't read this and you haven't read that, please put them in the comment section down below so that I'm actually aware of those books. It's probably 9 times out of 10 just because I haven't discovered those books yet. And like I said, I'm still researching and I'm still teaching myself. And as far as I'm concerned, I still have a lot of time to go. So I want to try and read and research as many different ways and methods as possible. So if you can help me out and help out other writers at the same time, please list those particular books or resources down below. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching my video. I'm sorry it's so long. It was supposed to be more of like a vlog, but I ended up deleting some of the other footage that I had when I was out and about the other day when I was actually filming it all. It's just a very crazy time of year and I'm just really tired. Like I said, thank you all for watching. And yeah, be sure to check out the books that I've mentioned and let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I'm gonna stop talking now. Yeah.